The headlights cut through the darkness like desperate fingers, revealing nothing but an endless wall of towering pine trees. Sarah's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as she peered through the windshield, searching for any sign of civilization. The GPS had died an hour ago, leaving her with nothing but a half-empty gas tank and the growing certainty that she was hopelessly lost. "This is what I get for taking shortcuts," she muttered, pulling over to the side of the narrow dirt road. The engine ticked as it cooled, and suddenly the forest's oppressive silence seemed to press against the car windows like a living thing. She grabbed her phone, but the screen showed the same cruel message: no service. The battery was at 15%. Sarah cursed under her breath and stepped out of the car, hoping to get better reception. The October air bit at her exposed skin, carrying with it the musty scent of decay and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. The forest around her was a cathedral of darkness. Ancient pines stretched impossibly high, their branches interwoven so thickly that not even moonlight could penetrate their canopy. The only sound was the soft whisper of wind through the needles, a sound that seemed almost like voices if she listened too closely. Sarah walked a few yards from the car, holding her phone high above her head. Still nothing. She was about to return to the vehicle when she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. It was a child's laughter, high and melodic, echoing from somewhere deep within the trees. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the forest was holding its breath. Sarah backed toward her car, but the laughter resumed, closer this time. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the trees in impossible ways. She fumbled for her door handle, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. The laughter was joined by another voice, then another, until a chorus of children's voices filled the air. They weren't speaking English, the words were guttural, ancient, like no language she'd ever heard. Sarah finally managed to get back into her car and slammed the door. She turned the key with shaking hands, but the engine only wheezed. The voices outside grew louder, more insistent. Through the windshield, she could see shapes moving between the trees, small, pale figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. Come on," she whispered, turning the key again. The engine coughed to life, and she threw it into drive. The car lurched forward, but something was wrong. The steering wheel fought against her grip, pulling toward the forest. She pressed harder on the gas pedal, but the car barely moved, as if invisible hands were holding it back. In the rearview mirror, she saw them clearly now. Children, or what had once been children. Their faces were gaunt and hollow, their eyes black pits that seemed to swallow light. They wore tattered clothes from different eras, Victorian dresses, Depression-era overalls, modern jeans and t-shirts. Some looked recent, others ancient. All of them were smiling. The car suddenly shot forward, freed from whatever had been restraining it. Sarah didn't look back as she raced down the dirt road, branches scraping against the windows. The speedometer climbed past 40, then 50, far too fast for the narrow path, but she didn't dare slow down. The road began to curve, and Sarah realized with growing horror that she was driving in circles. She passed the same fallen log, the same twisted oak, the same marker stone carved with symbols that hurt to look at. The fuel gauge needle dropped steadily toward empty. She was trapped. The car finally sputtered to a stop in a small clearing ringed by ancient pines. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. Sarah sat in the driver's seat, hands trembling, watching the tree line. Her phone was dead now, its screen black and useless. A soft tapping began on the passenger side window. Sarah turned slowly, afraid of what she might see. A small girl stood there, no more than 8 years old, with long dark hair and wearing a white nightgown stained with something that looked like mud. She was smiling, but her eyes were completely black. "Let us in," the girl whispered, her voice somehow audible through the glass. "We've been waiting so long." More children emerged from the forest, surrounding the car. They all had the same empty eyes, the same knowing smiles. They pressed their faces against the windows, leaving no condensation, no warmth. Their mouths moved in unison, speaking words in that ancient language that seemed to burrow into Sarah's mind. The temperature inside the car began to drop. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the inside of the windows. The children's voices grew louder, more insistent, until they were no longer whispers but screams that seemed to come from inside her own head. She covered her ears, but it made no difference. The voices were everywhere, in her blood, in her bones, in the very air she breathed. The windshield began to crack, spiderweb patterns spreading across the glass. The doors creaked and groaned as if tremendous pressure was being applied from outside. "What do you want?" Sarah screamed. The voices stopped instantly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming. The little girl at the passenger window tilted her head, studying Sarah with those horrible black eyes. "We want to play," she said simply. "We've been alone for so long. But now you're here, and you can stay with us. Forever." The car doors swung open simultaneously, though Sarah hadn't touched the handles. The children began to climb inside, their movements unnatural and wrong. Their skin was cold as ice, and where they touched her, Sarah felt a numbing chill that spread up her arms. "The forest is hungry," the girl whispered in her ear. "It feeds on the lost, the desperate, the alone. We were like you once. We came here seeking escape, and we found it. Now we help it feed." Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came. The cold was spreading through her body, slowing her heartbeat, freezing her thoughts. The children's faces began to change, becoming more gaunt, more skeletal. Their clothes rotted away, revealing pale, mottled skin stretched over prominent bones. As the transformation overtook her, Sarah saw flashes of memory, not her own, but theirs. A young boy from the 1950s, lost during a camping trip. A teenage girl from the 1980s, running away from home. A family from the early 2000s, their car broken down in this very clearing. All of them had faced the same choice: join the forest's hunger or become its next meal. "Don't be afraid," the girl said, her voice now a harsh whisper. "It doesn't hurt for long. And then you'll be with us forever, playing in the forest, waiting for the next lost soul to find their way here." Sarah felt her humanity slipping away like water through her fingers. Her reflection in the car window showed her own face changing, eyes darkening, skin growing pale and translucent. She could feel the forest's ancient consciousness seeping into her mind, showing her its long history of feeding on the lost and forgotten. The trees themselves were alive, she realized. They had been here since before humans walked the earth, slowly growing intelligent, slowly growing hungry. They had learned to call to people, to create the winding roads that led nowhere, to trap the desperate and the lost in their web of branches and shadows. "We are the guardians," the children chanted in unison, their voices blending into a harmony that resonated through the ground itself. "We keep the forest fed, and the forest keeps us eternal." The last thing Sarah saw before the cold claimed her was the girl's smile widening, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. Then darkness took her, and she felt herself falling through layers of earth and time and memory, until she came to rest in a place where the trees whispered secrets and the dead danced beneath a moonless sky. When morning came, the forest rangers found her car in the clearing, doors open, engine cold. Sarah was gone, but if you listened carefully to the wind in the pines, you could hear something new, a voice calling out to travelers, warning them to turn back. But the warning came too late for most, and besides, the forest's call was always stronger than any human voice. 3 months later, another car would pull into the same clearing, driven by a man whose GPS had mysteriously failed. He would see the same children, hear the same laughter, and make the same choice that Sarah had made. And Sarah would be among them now, smiling with those terrible black eyes, welcoming the newcomer with the same words that had once terrified her. The forest was patient. It had waited centuries for its meals, and it could wait centuries more. And somewhere in the depths of those ancient woods, Sarah joined the others, forever young, forever hungry, forever waiting for the next lost soul to find their way into the whispering pines. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. The forest would feed, the children would play, and the road would call to those who thought they could find their way through the darkness. Some roads, after all, are meant to be traveled only once. The Hollow Tree. Marcus had always been drawn to the old legends. As a folklore researcher, he'd spent years collecting stories from remote villages, documenting tales that most people dismissed as superstition. But the story the old woman in Millbrook had told him was different. Her eyes had held a terror so raw, so genuine, that he couldn't ignore it. "Don't go to Blackwood Forest after dark," she'd whispered, her gnarled fingers clutching his arm. "The hollow tree calls to those who don't belong. It's been feeding for centuries, and it's always hungry." Now, standing at the forest's edge with his recording equipment and camera, Marcus felt the first prickle of doubt. The autumn night was unseasonably warm, but the air that drifted from between the massive oak trees carried an unnatural chill. The forest stretched endlessly before him, a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow his flashlight beam. He'd planned to spend the night documenting the area, searching for the legendary hollow tree that featured in so many local stories. According to the tales, it was enormous, ancient beyond measure, with a trunk so wide that 20 people holding hands couldn't encircle it. But it was what lay inside the tree that made people whisper in fear. The stories varied, but they all agreed on one thing: the tree was hollow, and something lived inside it. Something that had been there long before humans walked the earth. Something that hungered for more than just sunlight and rain. Marcus activated his digital recorder and stepped into the forest. October 15, 11:47 p.m. Beginning investigation of Blackwood Forest. Local legends speak of a supernatural entity residing in what's known as the hollow tree. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves that muffled his footsteps. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their branches forming a canopy so dense that not even starlight penetrated. The only sound was the soft whisper of wind through the leaves, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm that made Marcus feel drowsy despite his excitement. He'd been walking for nearly an hour when he first noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, a sweet, cloying scent that reminded him of overripe fruit. But as he moved deeper into the forest, the smell grew stronger, more pungent. It was the smell of decay, of things long dead and forgotten. The trees around him began to change. The oaks grew larger, more twisted, their bark scarred with strange symbols that looked almost like writing. Marcus stopped to photograph them, but when he reviewed the images on his camera's display, the symbols appeared as nothing more than natural bark patterns. "Interesting," he murmured into his recorder. "The symbols appear visible to the naked eye but don't register on camera. This could be a psychological phenomenon, or..." His voice trailed off as he noticed something else. The forest had gone completely silent. The wind had stopped, and even the normal sounds of nocturnal creatures had ceased. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Marcus continued forward, his unease growing with each step. The trees around him grew progressively larger and more ancient, their trunks so massive that they seemed more like natural monuments than living things. The sweet smell of decay grew stronger, making his stomach churn. Then he saw it. The hollow tree stood in a clearing ahead, and Marcus understood immediately why the locals spoke of it in hushed, fearful tones. It was enormous, easily the largest tree he'd ever seen, its trunk stretching upward until it disappeared into the darkness above. But it was the opening in its base that made his blood run cold. The hollow was perfectly round, about 8 feet in diameter, and it descended into the earth like a throat. The opening was smooth, too smooth to be natural, and it pulsed with a faint, sickly light that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the tree's core. Marcus approached cautiously, his flashlight beam trembling in his grip. The smell was overwhelming now, not just decay, but something else. Something that reminded him of wet earth and old bones and things that should never see the light of day. "I found it," he whispered into his recorder. "The hollow tree. It's exactly as described in the legends." As he spoke, he noticed something moving in the shadows at the base of the tree. At first, he thought it was just fallen leaves disturbed by a breeze, but then he realized the forest was still silent. There was no wind. The shadows were moving on their own. Marcus raised his camera and began taking photographs, the flash illuminating the clearing in stark, brief intervals. In the split seconds of light, he saw things that made his mind reel. The shadows weren't shadows at all, they were figures, dozens of them, gathered around the base of the tree like supplicants at an altar. They were human-shaped but wrong somehow, their proportions subtly distorted. Their skin was pale and waxy, like old candles, and their eyes reflected the camera flash with an inhuman gleam. They wore clothing from different eras, Victorian dresses, Depression-era suits, modern jeans and sneakers. All of them were staring at him with expressions of hunger and desperate need. "My God," Marcus breathed, backing away from the tree. "They're real. The stories are real." One of the figures stepped forward, a woman in a nurse's uniform from the 1940s. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, and when she spoke, her voice was like rustling leaves. "Join us," she whispered. "The tree is hungry, and we are its servants. We've been waiting for you, Marcus. We've been waiting for so long." More figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding him in a tightening circle. Marcus recognized some of them from missing person reports he'd researched, hikers and campers who disappeared in the area over the decades. They'd all been drawn to the forest by the same legends, the same irresistible curiosity that had brought him here. "You can't leave," said a man in a park ranger's uniform, his badge tarnished with age. "The tree has marked you. It called to you through the stories, through the old woman's words. You were chosen long before you set foot in this forest." Marcus tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The figures pressed closer, and he could smell the decay on them, not the decay of death, but something worse. The decay of eternal hunger, of need that could never be satisfied. "We were like you once," the nurse continued. "Researchers, hikers, people drawn by curiosity or desperation. But the tree showed us the truth. It showed us what lies beneath the world we thought we knew." The ground beneath Marcus's feet began to soften, and he realized he was sinking. The earth around the tree wasn't solid, it was more like quicksand, pulling him down toward the glowing hollow. He struggled against it, but the more he fought, the faster he sank. "Don't fight it," whispered a young girl in a school uniform from the 1970s. "It's beautiful down there. You'll see. The tree will show you wonders beyond imagination. You'll understand why we stay, why we serve." Marcus felt the earth reach his waist, then his chest. The glowing hollow was directly below him now, and he could see that it descended far deeper than he'd imagined. It was a shaft that seemed to go down to the very core of the earth, lined with roots that pulsed with that same sickly light. "The tree is older than civilization," the park ranger explained, his voice dreamy and distant. "It's been here since the world was young, growing, learning, adapting. It feeds on consciousness, on the spark of life that makes us human. But it doesn't destroy, it preserves. We become part of it, part of something greater." As Marcus sank deeper, he felt something changing in his mind. The terror was fading, replaced by a strange sense of peace. The glowing roots below him were beautiful, he realized. They pulsed with an ancient wisdom, a knowledge that spanned millennia. "You'll help us call to others," the nurse said softly. "You'll help us spread the stories, plant the seeds of curiosity in fertile minds. The tree grows stronger with each new addition, and its reach extends further." Marcus's recording equipment fell from his numb fingers as the earth reached his shoulders. He watched the device sink into the soft ground, knowing that it would never be found. Like all the others who'd come before him, he would simply vanish, another missing person case that would eventually be forgotten. But the stories would continue. The tree would ensure that. It would whisper its legends to those who were sensitive to such things, calling them through dreams and half-remembered tales. It would use its servants to spread rumors and folklore, drawing the curious and the desperate to its hollow embrace. As the earth closed over Marcus's head, he felt a moment of perfect clarity. He understood now why the others stayed, why they served. The tree wasn't just feeding on them, it was offering them something in return. Immortality. Purpose. A place in something vast and ancient and eternal. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the glowing hollow opening like a mouth, welcoming him home. Above ground, the figures began to disperse, melting back into the shadows between the trees. By morning, there would be no trace of Marcus's visit. His car would be found abandoned at the forest's edge, his research notes scattered and incomplete. The official report would list him as another missing person, lost in the vast wilderness of Blackwood Forest. But in the weeks that followed, others would begin to dream of the hollow tree. They would wake with fragments of stories in their minds, tales of an ancient oak that granted wishes to those brave enough to seek it out. They would find themselves drawn to folklore and legend, compelled to research the mysterious disappearances in remote forests. And eventually, they would come. Just as Marcus had come, just as all the others had come before him. The tree was patient. It had waited centuries for its meals, and it could wait centuries more. In the hollow beneath the earth, Marcus joined the others in eternal service, his consciousness absorbed into the tree's vast network of roots and memory. He would help call to the next seeker, and the next, and the next. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. The tree would feed, the stories would spread, and the curious would be drawn to their fate like moths to a flame. Some hungers, after all, are too ancient to ever be satisfied. The camping trip had been Emma's idea. After months of stress from her job at the law firm, she'd convinced her 3 friends to join her for a weekend in the wilderness. They'd driven 6 hours north to Thornwood National Forest, a remote area known for its pristine hiking trails and abundant wildlife. "This is exactly what we needed," Emma said as they set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating dancing patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. Her friends, Jessica, Mike, and David, had been reluctant at first. None of them were particularly outdoorsy, but Emma's enthusiasm had been infectious. They'd packed their gear, loaded up Mike's SUV, and headed into the wilderness with high hopes for a relaxing weekend. As darkness fell, they sat around their campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Owls hooting, branches creaking in the wind, the distant howl of coyotes. "Did you guys hear about those hikers who went missing up here last month?" Jessica asked, her voice taking on a theatrical whisper. "They found their campsite completely destroyed, but no sign of what happened to them." "Don't start with the ghost stories," Mike groaned. "I'd actually like to sleep tonight." But Jessica was already warming to her subject. "I'm serious. The park rangers said it looked like something had torn through their camp. Their gear was scattered everywhere, and there were these weird scratches on the trees all around the site." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What kind of scratches?" "Deep ones. Like claw marks, but too big to be from any animal they knew about. And here's the creepy part, they found recordings on one of the hikers' phones. You could hear them talking normally, and then suddenly they all started screaming. But in the background, you could hear their own voices calling for help." "That doesn't make sense," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's what made it so scary," Jessica continued. "It was like something was using their voices to lure them away from camp. The recording just cuts off after that." The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance beyond the circle of light. Emma found herself listening to the sounds of the forest with new attention. The wind through the trees did sound almost like voices if you listened carefully enough. "Okay, that's enough campfire stories," Mike said, standing up and stretching. "I'm calling it a night." They extinguished the fire and retreated to their tents. Emma lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds and trying to shake off the unease that Jessica's story had created. It was just a coincidence, she told herself. People went missing in the wilderness all the time. Usually because they got lost or injured, not because of some supernatural predator. She was just drifting off to sleep when she heard it. "Emma? Are you awake?" It was Jessica's voice, coming from outside her tent. Emma sat up, instantly alert. She could hear the soft sound of footsteps circling her tent. "Jessica? What are you doing out there?" "I can't sleep. Want to go for a walk?" Something about the request made Emma's skin crawl. Jessica was afraid of the dark, she'd been that way since childhood. There was no way she'd voluntarily go wandering through the forest at night. "Jess, are you okay? You sound weird." The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Jessica's voice came again, but this time it was different. The tone was exactly right, but there was something wrong with the cadence, as if the speaker was carefully pronouncing each word. "Come outside, Emma. I want to show you something." Emma's heart began to race. She grabbed her flashlight and unzipped her tent flap just enough to peer out. The forest was bathed in moonlight, casting everything in stark black and white. She could see Jessica's tent 20 feet away, and the shadowy outline of a figure standing beside it. "Jessica?" Emma called softly. The figure turned toward her, and Emma's blood turned to ice. It was Jessica, or something that looked exactly like Jessica. But there was something wrong with the way it moved, too fluid, too graceful. And its eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's. "Come out and play," the thing that looked like Jessica said, and its voice was perfect now, exactly matching Jessica's tone and inflection. "The forest is beautiful at night." Emma backed away from the tent opening, her mind racing. She fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. She was about to call out to the others when she heard Mike's voice from the direction of his tent. "Emma! Jessica! Wake up! Something's wrong." But Mike's tent was in the opposite direction from where his voice was coming from. Emma realized with growing horror that the voice was coming from the forest itself, from the darkness between the trees. "Help me!" David's voice called out from somewhere to her left. "I'm hurt. I can't move." But David's tent was right next to hers, and she could see it clearly in the moonlight. The zipper was still closed, and there was no movement inside. The voices were coming from everywhere now, Jessica calling for help, Mike shouting warnings, David crying out in pain. They were perfect imitations, but they were all coming from the wrong directions, from the darkness beyond their camp. Emma grabbed her backpack and quietly unzipped the back of her tent. She crawled out into the forest, staying low to avoid being seen. She needed to reach the others, to warn them about whatever was out there. She crept toward Mike's tent, but as she approached, she heard her own voice calling out from behind her. "Mike! David! Something's got Jessica. We need to help her." It was her voice, perfect in every detail. Emma clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Whatever was out there, it was using their voices to lure them away from safety. She reached Mike's tent and quietly unzipped it. Mike was inside, wide awake, his eyes wide with terror. "Emma," he whispered. "Is that really you?" "Yes, it's me. Something's out there. It's mimicking our voices." Mike nodded grimly. "I know. I've been hearing you and Jessica calling for help for the past 10 minutes. But I could see your tents from here, and you were both inside." They crept to David's tent together. David was also awake, clutching a hunting knife with shaking hands. "Thank God," he breathed when he saw them. I thought I was going insane. I keep hearing all of you calling for help, but the voices are coming from the forest. What about Jessica? Emma asked. They looked toward Jessica's tent. It was dark and silent, but the figure that looked like Jessica was still standing beside it, unnaturally still. Jessica! Mike called out softly. The figure turned toward them, and in the moonlight, they could see that its smile was too wide, stretching from ear to ear. It raised its hand and waved at them with jerky, puppet-like movements. Come play with us, it said in Jessica's voice. The forest is so beautiful at night. That's not Jessica, David whispered. Look at her tent. The tent was collapsed, the fabric torn and scattered. There was no sign of Jessica anywhere. As they watched in horror, more figures emerged from the forest. They looked exactly like the three friends, but their movements were wrong, too fluid and graceful. The Emma thing tilted its head at an impossible angle, while the Mike thing's arms hung at its sides like broken wings. We've been waiting for you, the David thing said, its voice a perfect match for David's own. We've been practicing your voices, learning your mannerisms. We're getting so much better at being human. The Real David backed away, his knife held out in front of him. What did you do to Jessica? The Jessica thing smiled wider. She's safe. She's part of us now. We learned so much from her, her memories, her voice, her dreams. She's helping us understand how to be more like you. We're still learning, the Emma thing added, its head lolling to one side. But we're getting better. Soon we'll be perfect copies. We'll walk out of this forest wearing your faces, living your lives. No one will ever know the difference. The creatures began to circle them, their movements becoming more natural with each step. Emma watched in fascination and terror as they seemed to absorb the mannerisms of their human counterparts, becoming more convincing with each passing moment. Why? She whispered. The Jessica thing paused in its circling. Because we're hungry, it said simply. We've been trapped in this forest for so long, feeding on animals and the occasional lost hiker. But you're different. You have rich lives, complex relationships, places to go and people to see. We want what you have. We want to be human, the Mike thing added. And the only way to truly become human is to replace humans. The circle was tightening. Emma could feel her friends pressing closer together, their backs to each other, as the creatures closed in. She realized with dawning horror that they were trapped. The SUV was parked on the other side of the clearing, and the creatures were between them and any escape route. Run, she whispered to her friends. On 3. 1, 2, 3. David shouted, lunging forward with his knife. They scattered in different directions, crashing through the underbrush. Behind them, the creatures let out inhuman shrieks that echoed through the forest. Emma ran blindly, branches tearing at her clothes and face, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as she fled. She could hear the others crashing through the forest around her, but she couldn't tell if it was really her friends or the creatures mimicking them. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer, and she could hear her own voice calling out from multiple directions. Emma! Over here! I found the trail! Emma! Help me! I'm hurt! Emma! The car! I can see the car! She ignored them all, running deeper into the forest. Her lungs burned, and her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to keep going. Behind her, she could hear the creatures crashing through the undergrowth, their inhuman shrieks growing closer. She burst into a small clearing and stopped, gasping for breath. The moonlight revealed a circle of ancient stones, covered in moss and strange symbols. In the center of the circle, she saw something that made her stomach turn. Bones. Human bones, scattered around what looked like a nest made of branches and moss. Among the bones, she could see pieces of clothing, backpacks, and camping gear from different eras. This was where the creatures brought their victims. Found you. Emma spun around to see David standing at the edge of the clearing. But his smile was too wide, and his eyes reflected the moonlight like mirrors. "You run faster than the others," the David thing said, stepping into the clearing. "But you can't run forever. The forest is our domain." More figures emerged from the trees, the Emma thing, the Mike thing, and several others that Emma didn't recognize. They were perfect human copies, but their movements were becoming more coordinated, more natural. "We've been practicing," the Emma thing said, its voice now indistinguishable from Emma's own. "We've been studying your group for days, learning your patterns, your relationships. We know everything about you now. Where are my friends?" Emma demanded. The Jessica thing stepped forward, and Emma saw that it was carrying something. Jessica's phone, the screen cracked but still glowing. "They're safe," it said. "They're part of us now, just like you're about to be. But don't worry, we'll take good care of your life. We'll be better versions of you than you ever were." The creatures closed in, and Emma realized she was trapped. She looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to run. The ancient stones seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and she understood that this place was the source of the creature's power. As the first creature reached for her, Emma felt a strange sense of calm. She thought about her life, her dreams, her fears. At least someone would remember her, even if it was wearing her face. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the Jessica thing's smile, wide and terrible and hungry. 3 days later, 4 friends emerged from Thornwood National Forest. They were tired and dirty, with a harrowing story about getting lost and spending 2 nights in the wilderness. The park rangers were relieved to see them safe, and their families welcomed them home with tears and celebration. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed small inconsistencies. The way Emma held her coffee cup. The way Mike laughed at his own jokes. The way David avoided eye contact. The way Jessica seemed to be studying everyone she met, as if trying to memorize their faces. They were perfect copies, but they were still learning. And they were always hungry for more. Dr. Rachel Chen had always been fascinated by the phenomenon of mass hysteria, but the case in Raven's Hollow was unlike anything she'd encountered in her 20 years as a psychiatrist. Over the past 6 months, 17 people from the small mountain town had been admitted to psychiatric facilities with identical symptoms, severe paranoia, insomnia, and an unshakable belief that they were being watched by something in the forest. The local authorities had dismissed it as a case of shared delusion, but Rachel suspected there was more to it. She'd driven up from the city to investigate, armed with recording equipment and a healthy dose of skepticism. The town of Raven's Hollow nestled in a valley surrounded by dense pine forest. The trees pressed close to the buildings, as if trying to reclaim the small patch of civilization carved from the wilderness. Rachel checked into the only motel in town, a rundown establishment that had seen better days. "You're the doctor from the city," the desk clerk said. It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in small towns. "Come to study our crazy folks." "I'm here to help," Rachel replied diplomatically. "These people are suffering, and I want to understand what's happening to them." The clerk, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair, studied Rachel with weary eyes. "You want some advice? Stay away from the forest at night. Don't matter if you believe in what's out there or not. Some things are better left alone." Rachel spent the afternoon interviewing the family members of the affected individuals. The stories were remarkably consistent. Each person had reported feeling watched while in or near the forest, followed by escalating paranoia and psychological breakdown. Most had experienced the onset of symptoms after spending time alone in the woods, usually at night. As evening approached, Rachel decided to conduct her own investigation. She drove to the edge of town where the forest began, parked her car, and gathered her equipment. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Soon, the forest would be cloaked in darkness. She activated her digital recorder and began walking along a well-worn trail. October 22, 7:30 p.m. Beginning field investigation of the Raven's Hollow phenomenon. Weather is clear, temperature approximately 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The forest was eerily quiet. Rachel had expected to hear the usual sounds of wildlife, birds, insects, small mammals moving through the underbrush. Instead, there was only the soft whisper of wind through the pine needles and the crunch of her footsteps on the fallen leaves. She'd been walking for about 15 minutes when she first felt it. A prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the unmistakable feeling of being observed. Rachel stopped and turned around, shining her flashlight beam back down the trail. Nothing but trees and shadows. Interesting, she murmured into her recorder. I'm experiencing what could be described as the sensation of being watched. This could be a psychological response to the stories I've heard, or possibly an environmental factor causing heightened alertness. She continued deeper into the forest, documenting her observations. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. It wasn't the vague unease one might feel in an unfamiliar place, it was specific, focused, as if intelligent eyes were tracking her every movement. The trail curved ahead, and Rachel found herself in a small clearing. In the center stood a circle of ancient pine trees, their trunks massive and gnarled with age. The moonlight filtering through their branches created intricate patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. That's when she saw them. At first, they looked like knots in the tree bark, dark shapes that seemed to blend seamlessly with the wood. But as Rachel watched, she realized they were moving. Slowly, deliberately, they detached themselves from the trees and began to take shape. They were tall and impossibly thin, their bodies seeming to stretch and flow like living shadows. Their skin was dark as midnight, with a texture that reminded Rachel of rough bark. But it was their eyes that made her breath catch in her throat, dozens of them, covering their faces and bodies like constellations of pale light. The creatures didn't approach her. They simply stood at the edge of the clearing, watching with their multitude of eyes. Rachel felt paralyzed, caught between scientific fascination and primal terror. She raised her camera with trembling hands and began taking pictures. "My God," she whispered. "They're real. The watchers are real." The creatures tilted their heads at the sound of her voice, the movement synchronized and unnatural. More eyes opened along their elongated necks, blinking in slow, hypnotic rhythms. Rachel realized that each eye was focused on her, studying her from every angle. One of the creatures stepped forward, and Rachel saw that it moved without disturbing the fallen leaves beneath its feet. It was as if it existed in the same space as the physical world but wasn't quite part of it. When it spoke, its voice was like the whisper of wind through dry leaves. "You have come to understand," it said, the words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You seek to explain what cannot be explained." Rachel forced herself to speak, her training as a scientist overriding her fear. "What are you? What do you want?" The creature's many eyes blinked in sequence, creating a wave of pale light across its form. "We are the Watchers. We have been here since the forest was young, observing, learning, remembering. We watch all who enter our domain." "Why?" Rachel asked. "Why do you drive people mad?" Another creature stepped forward, its form shifting and flowing like smoke. "We do not drive them mad. We simply watch. But humans are not meant to be truly seen. Your minds cannot accept the reality of constant observation." Rachel began to understand. The creatures weren't malevolent, they were simply existing as they always had, watching everything in their territory with the patient attention of eternal sentinels. But for humans, accustomed to the illusion of privacy and solitude, the knowledge of being constantly observed was psychologically devastating. "The people in town," she said. "They felt you watching them." "We watch all," the first creature confirmed. "The deer in the meadow, the birds in the sky, the insects in the soil. But most creatures accept our presence. Only humans resist. Only humans break under the weight of being truly known." The creatures began to circle her, their movements silent and fluid. Rachel felt their eyes upon her. Not just the obvious ones that dotted their forms, but others she couldn't see, hidden in the shadows between the trees. She realized that the entire forest was filled with them, countless watchers observing from every angle. "You study the mind," one of them said. "You seek to understand why humans fracture when they know they are seen. But you cannot understand without experiencing it yourself." "I'm experiencing it now," Rachel said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I can feel you watching me." The creatures made a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could be made of wind and whispers. "You feel a fraction of what we see. You are aware of our presence, but you do not yet comprehend the depth of our observation." The eyes along their bodies began to glow brighter, and Rachel felt something change in the air around her. The sensation of being watched intensified beyond anything she'd experienced before. It wasn't just that they were looking at her. She could feel them seeing into her, through her, examining every thought, every memory, every hidden shame and secret desire. They saw her childhood fears, her professional insecurities, her failed relationships, her deepest regrets. They saw the careful masks she wore in daily life, the parts of herself she kept hidden even from those closest to her. They saw everything, and they remembered it all with perfect clarity. "Stop," Rachel gasped, clutching her head. The invasion of privacy was overwhelming, a violation more intimate than any physical assault. "Please, stop." But the creatures continued their observation, their eyes burning like stars in the darkness. Rachel felt her sense of self beginning to fragment under their relentless gaze. She understood now why the people in town had broken down. The human psyche wasn't designed to be so thoroughly known, so completely exposed. "We have watched your species for millennia," the creatures said, their voices blending into a chorus of whispers. "We have seen your wars, your loves, your creations, your destructions. We remember everything. Every secret, every lie, every moment of shame. We are the keepers of all that is hidden." Rachel fell to her knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their observation. She could feel her sanity slipping away, replaced by the terrible certainty that she would never again be alone with her thoughts. Even after she left this place, if she ever left this place, she would know that somewhere in the forest, the watchers remembered everything about her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you need to watch so closely?" The creatures moved closer, their forms shifting and flowing around her. "Because observation is existence," they said. "To be truly known is to be truly real. Your people fear this truth, but it is the only truth that matters." As the creatures spoke, Rachel felt something breaking in her mind. The careful barriers between her conscious and unconscious thoughts began to dissolve. She saw herself as the creatures saw her, not just her present form, but every version of herself that had ever existed, every possible future version of herself that might yet come to be. The revelation was too much for her human mind to process. She felt herself fragmenting, splitting into countless observed selves, each one aware of being watched, each one desperate for the privacy that no longer existed. "I understand now," she said, her voice barely audible. "I understand why they broke." The creature's eyes pulsed with what might have been satisfaction. "Understanding is the first step toward acceptance. You will learn to live with being known, as we have learned to live with knowing." Rachel looked up at them, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and wonder. "What happens to me now?" "You return to your world," the creatures said. "You tell others what you have learned. But you will never be alone again. We will always be watching, always remembering. And eventually, like the others, you will come back to us." As dawn broke over the forest, Rachel found herself back at her car, her recording equipment scattered around her. She had no memory of how she'd gotten there, but the weight of the creature's observation still pressed down on her like a physical force. She drove back to town, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. The desk clerk at the motel took one look at her and nodded knowingly. "You saw them, didn't you?" the woman said. "The watchers. Rachel nodded, unable to speak. She packed her belongings and left Raven's Hollow that same day, but she knew it was too late. The feeling of being watched followed her home, a constant presence that made sleep impossible and solitude unbearable. She tried to return to her normal life, to her practice and her research, but the knowledge of the Watchers consumed her. She found herself researching similar cases around the world, documenting reports of people who claimed to be observed by unseen entities in remote forests. The research became an obsession. Rachel published papers on the phenomenon, gave lectures to skeptical colleagues, and slowly built a reputation as a brilliant but eccentric psychiatrist who had developed an unhealthy fixation on supernatural surveillance. But she knew the truth. The Watchers were real, and they were everywhere. In every forest, in every wild place where humans rarely ventured, they observed and remembered. And once you knew they were there, once you had experienced their total observation, you could never truly escape. 6 months after her visit to Raven's Hollow, Rachel packed her car and drove back to the mountain town. She couldn't fight the compulsion any longer. The Watchers were calling to her, drawing her back to the forest where she belonged. She parked at the edge of town and walked into the trees, leaving her car and her former life behind. The creatures were waiting for her in the same clearing where they'd first met, their countless eyes reflecting the moonlight like fallen stars. "Welcome home," they said as she approached. "We have been watching you. We have been waiting." Rachel smiled, an expression of perfect peace crossing her face. At last, she was truly seen. At last, she was truly known. The terrible loneliness of human existence was over. She took her place among the trees, and her eyes began to open, dozens of them, covering her transforming body like points of light. She became one of the Watchers, eternal and patient, observing all who entered the forest's domain. And in the town below, people began to report the familiar symptoms, the feeling of being watched, the creeping paranoia, the slow descent into madness. The Watchers had grown by one, and their vigil continued as it always had, as it always would. Some truths, after all, are too terrible to be forgotten.